and I'm going to admit everybody now as well. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for your patience in the waiting room there. We're just waiting for a couple more people to join us. We'll give them a chance to get in. Lovely. All right. A couple more. All right. Fantastic. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am currently broadcasting to you from, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm so pleased to be here with you all tonight for this discussion of Michael Symons' new book, Meals Matter, A Radical Economics Through Gastronomy. Before I hand you over to our speakers this evening, I'd like to quickly reiterate some of the information that I mentioned in the email that you were sent earlier with your link to join tonight's event. So you have all automatically been placed on mute, as you've no doubt noticed by now. That, however, doesn't mean that Michael isn't keen to answer your questions. He certainly is. The way that we do questions at Avid Reader is a little bit different than you might be familiar with, so I'll just quickly run you through it. If you'd like to send a question through, please do so using the chat box. You should be able to find it towards the bottom left of your screen. If you can't see it, then don't worry too much. I'm going to be using it to send you the link that you can use to purchase your copies of Meals Matter. And when I do, that chat box will pop up on your screen. So type in your questions there. They'll come straight through to me and I will be passing them on to Dominic, who will read them out later this evening. So I'd now like to introduce Michael Symons. Michael is the author of One Continuous Picnic, A Gastronomic History of Australia, and A History of Cooks and Cooking, among other works. He is also a former journalist and restaurateur. In conversation with Michael tonight is Dominic Ziegler. Dominic is a journalist working with The Economist, and I will now hand you over to him so that he can kick things off the evening. So Dominic, please take it from here.
Thank you very much, Emma Kay, and hello and good evening to everybody who's joined us. I'm speaking to you from Hong Kong. Michael is in Sydney. I've had the great fortune of stumbling across Avid Reader on my one time in Brisbane 2 years ago, and I can't wait to get back to the great city and the best bookshop that I had seen for months. So fantastic. I'm very, very honored to be with you tonight. Michael, I was really absorbed by Meals Matter. I thought it was a wonderful book and very original. It's not a cookbook. It's not really a history of gastronomy, although your personal journey through the world of gastronomy definitely forms part of it. It's not an economics treatise, but what you do is, in the title, you put meals and coming together around a table right at the heart, not only of human fellowship and conviviality, but at the heart of what you think should now be a reconfigured economy, a return to an understanding of the importance in economic terms of meals, how they're produced, how they come together, and how they affect us humans around that table. Now, both you and I are acutely aware of the absurdity of talking about coming together over food and drink when we are separated by the virus and by geographical distance. So I just want to explain to the audience that your suggestion is a superb one, and I would encourage everybody who's listening to join us in on it. And that suggestion was to open a bottle of champagne or something nice, to have something to eat at the same time. So if you will excuse the two of us, we're now going to just do that and pour ourselves a tipple to get the evening going.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that. Here we go. Yeah, the book, unfortunately, the virus has meant that it's been somewhat submerged, including the possibilities of launching the thing with champagne. So let's toast the world and the economies within it. Look out. Hey, I have my wife and my daughter here, so there are at least three of us being very convivial at this moment. I will pour something for them, but maybe you can start conversing as well, Dominic.
Absolutely, and I could see some of our audience are definitely on the same page as us. So very good health, everyone, and to you, Michael. So let's kick off.
Yep.
I mean, I'd love to ask you first, just a bit about your own personal involvement with food and with meals, and how is it that meals came to be at the center of your life? How did they move that way? And how did you make what in the book you describe as your gastronomic turn? Tell us a bit about that, some of the experiences that informed that journey.
Yeah, well, yeah, cheers, everyone. Yeah, I mean, we're all interested in meals. We all have them all the time, and they are extremely important to everyone. But one of the things that's happened over, particularly the last couple of 100 years, is that they've been sort of belittled. One of the main things that I point out in the book is that money has become exceedingly important. It rolls our lives. Well, if you can think, oh, well, meals should really take that place, then you can start to understand the book. But it's taken me a long time to really appreciate how important meals are. Like, I think when people see the title of the book, they either go, oh, radical, that's me, but not meals, or they go, economics, yeah, I'm interested or I'm not, and gastronomy, no, you know, it's trying to go a long way, but it's based very much on the importance of meals. And well, one of the things I try and do in the book is to describe meals. I didn't spend a lot of time describing one meal, but maybe I'll mention it here. And it answers your question about how I got quite serious about gastronomy. I was the Sydney Morning Herald's young environmental writer back in the late 60s, early 70s. And we did some fantastic things. We did famously, very famously, the Polluters Series. I congratulated my paper many times on the fact that they took seriously. We went around as journalists and sniffed out the pollution from the Shell refinery, the pollution from the Ford factory, from the pulp and paper mill on Botany Bay, and the paper, to its credit, took them on and said, this is scandalous. We can't have pollution like that. So I spent quite some weeks digging around, you know, the worst parts of Sydney, most polluted parts of Sydney. And then also I became interested in a whole lot of other things, but one of the things was the limits to growth. You might, Dom, you might be familiar with it, but anyhow, it's the Meadows couple and various systems scientists who in 1971, I think it was, published a study sponsored by the Club of Rome to show what dire straits the world was getting into, and it was very simple. They got a very basic computer program. They just put in resources, pollution, population, and a few variables. And when you put it into the computer, you think, oh well, the world's going to finish about 2030. So you improve your figures very roughly. You might say, oh, let's assume the population doesn't rise, but the pollution does, or whatever, as a result of technical accomplishments, and you end up, oh, well, we can get it back to, 2025, or, it's not very flexible. So their thing, their dire prediction for the world, on top of seeing what firsthand how terrible things looked in Sydney, much worse than they are now. The things we helped clean the city up a lot, but all that led to the really frantic pace of journalism led to my somewhat breaking down and becoming extremely depressed for some months, years really, and I remember very well. I can only tell you that we had roast lamb, baked lamb leg. It was in Balmain, and I was there with 3 other friends. I was a good friend with Camille Guy, and we had this absolutely beautiful meal. This would have been 71, something like that, 72 maybe. And I moved over to the other side of the room and watched these 3 people enjoying still at the meal, sitting at the table chatting. And somehow that just got to me. I could see human beings as creatures based around the table. And believe it or not, I felt quite cheerful for the first time in months. And over the years, I've stuck to that. I've thought, I think, it grounded me, and I think it grounds other people to pay attention to what they're eating and why it should be like that, and how capitalism is involved, or why ecology counts, etc., etc. There's so much that comes out of the meal, how we should run our society. So that's and how we should run our economics, and how we should regard economics just flows from that central thing of human beings sharing food around a table.
Well, and indeed, at the start of every one of your chapters, you describe a meal. And one of the things that really, comes through for me is that this doesn't have to be, all caviar and truffles and bling dining. It's much more essential than that. And meals, special meals, can be really quite humble ones as well. And I think something that runs all the way through your book is this idea of carpe diem, seize the day. And this was, of course, the view of Epicurus, the Greek philosopher. You do go back a long way to try to establish the sort of the river of gastronomy that now flows through your house in Sydney, and very much a sense that happiness, contentment is a process, not a final goal. It's the pursuit, and it's the enjoyment. One of the figures who features prominently in your book, and I don't think you would disagree, is Jean Anthelme Brillat-Savarin, who lived in the late 18th and early 19th century. He comes across. He wrote, of course, the great tome La Physiologie du Goût, and I don't know how you yourself translate that. Like a lot of words around this topic, French seems to serve better than other languages. But the physiology of taste around the pleasures of the table, or table pleasure, as you put it. Brillat-Savarin comes across as a really sort of humane man, a man who's really interested in life, what motivates us. He also comes across as a very sort of non-judgmental kind of person, but with a sense of how we as humans are bound up with suffering, but a sense of how to escape from suffering by being together. You describe him as having a puckish profundity, and there's no doubt that he is a bit of a sort of food geek. He wants to determine whether mocha coffee is better pounded or ground, so he tries both. He quizzes his friends about truffles and their impact on lovemaking, for instance. But he has a sense of humor throughout it all. But above all, he seems to as you argue, he seems to understand something that points to economics here. This is where I want to bring this in, to the notion that, you know, the trade in things that produces, that allows farmer to produce for the market or to be sold locally or wherever, the daily consumption of things that are brought to the table, cooked, collectively consumed, has both the effect of strengthening common bonds between human beings, but also lies at the heart of what you consider to be the best possible type of economy. Is that correct?
I find him profound. I mean, he's the greatest writer in this area. One of his problems is this problem of food being multifaceted and leading all over the place. But another one is that people, it's easily trivialized. And so he's been criticized a lot for being trivial or avuncular, and feminists have complained about his attitudes and so forth. But very, very rarely have people, and some people do like his literary style, but very rarely people have really picked up on how serious he is underneath this. I mean, he talks about the end of the world, he talks about death, he talks about obesity. I mean, this is a man who's, for good reason, as I try to explain, interested in a whole lot of not necessarily pretty topics, and yet he has this reputation. In fact, back in that, one of the things many things, unfortunately, my book took forever to write, and I found out so much that surprised me. But one of the things that was true in his day was that physiology and economics were almost synonymous. They talked, for example, about the body politic for the political economy, and the individual human, the physiological person, was called the animal economy. So physiology was animal economy. The political economy was about the body politic. The two ideas are tied up, and one of the crimes of modern economics is to divide that. That he understood very well how everything seems so connected. Everything had to be enjoyable as much as it could be deadly. I'm one of those people who can just read it all the time and find something new, because I mean, he took 70 years. I probably shouldn't give away my big discovery at the end of the chapter, but he took for 70 years he was studying humans, and particularly through their meals. And of course he found out a lot of interesting things that we could learn from, and I hope I have. But yeah, he would have to be my hero. Epicurus is another great in philosophy, because but typically in putting food and gastronomy and the importance of meals down, philosophers say, oh no, Epicurus had nothing to do with meals, and yet he said that the pleasure of everything depended on the pleasure of the stomach. Now, how you get it out of that, you have to say, oh, he didn't really say it, and all sorts of things that I've tried. But essentially we've had, as I say, 200 years of people trying to say that meals aren't important. And one of the last of the Enlightenment figures really that really understood how this all fitted together in a much better way than we do now was Brillat-Savarin. Yep, hero of mine. Well,
it's a pity if we're not allowed to divulge what you discovered, but suffice it to say that he died a single man, had never married, but you discovered a deep love early in his life in ways that are highly relevant to your topic of food and its sufficiency. Just, you know, one question there is he writes about gourmandise, and maybe you can define in your own words what this French term means to you, but he seemed to be clear that there is a distinction between gourmandise and gluttony. The latter, he said, he would leave to the moralist or to the doctor. But your field, your topic is gourmandise. Just tell us briefly what you see that to mean.
Well, what a lot of those figures, and including him and until then, but and as you might appreciate, the book has a lot about liberal theorists like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and Rousseau, etc. But one thing that they really, what they thought was that people were driven by their appetites. That was the rock bottom. What can we know about ourselves, about the world? I don't know. It's very complicated, but it's certainly, that's for sure, I'm driven by my appetites. So Brillat-Savarin kind of developed that. He said, oh, well, if you're driven by your appetites, you're driven to join with other people. So that rather than this being an individualistic philosophy, it becomes very much a cooperative one where we all gain, not just by sitting around a table, but by all bringing food in that the cook distributes to us. So the labor is distributed and food is distributed at the meal. And he thought, well, okay, so you have an appetite, you enjoy it. That process is gourmandise, the actual enjoying of the food. But then you have to think about it and start to construct ideas about how this works. And that became his gastronomy. So I think gourmandise, and everyone says, oh, he's all about great food. But as you say, meals for him were varied, extremely varied, from the worst, whatever that might mean, to the best. And they were all important, and we're all using our appetites to try and improve them, and through that we would be improving the world, etc., etc., etc.
Now, we do have time constraints, and so I suggest that perhaps we run fairly quickly through what we would see as the classical liberal economists, who, by and large, get what you think is important about food. They don't prioritize. They don't prioritize money. Something else that strikes me about everybody who loves food is that they are not driven primarily, or at least solely, by some kind of higher authority. I mean, I was struck by the number of times that people you write about, philosophers, economists, and the like, who say, in effect, that life doesn't begin with obedience to some higher authority or virtue, whether that be divine or some higher government on earth, but that life begins with the sensations and the pleasures and the companions and the cooperation that come with meals. But just to sort of, and Locke, for instance, and John Stuart Mill, whom you both write about, would, I think, subscribe to that philosophy. But just to fast forward, you do spend time with what their enemies, and I think that you count as one, would call neoliberal economists, because they tend not to call themselves that. And in particular, with the 20th century father of the Austrian school of economics, Ludwig von Mises. Now, you have it in for him. I mean, granted, he never boiled an egg in his life, and he thought that instant coffee was the best invention of the 20th century. I feel a little sorry for him because of his stern upbringing. His mother would sit at one end of the long table, he would sit at the other, and she would say nothing throughout the meal. I feel sorry for his wife because he never introduced, or his future wife, because he never introduced her to his mother for as long as his mother was alive. But having said that, you have a lot to find fault with him. The path that you have described for centuries in terms of gastronomy, this understanding that you have talked about, seems to get lost as we approach the modern era, and money becomes the god of markets. Tell us a bit about von Mises and how you came to this
Right.
to
Well,
this attitude.
That I distinguish very firmly between liberalism and so-called classical liberalism. Locke and his contemporaries around here, the Enlightenment figures were liberals. And yes, as you say, they if the king deserted them or God deserted them, what do they believe in? As I say, the appetite is the rock bottom where you have to argue from that, which they did. But as you would appreciate, The Economist grew up, the magazine, the weekly, grew up in, I think it was 1843. Became a voice for classical liberalism. Now, classical liberalism can be a bit of a mixture, but essentially, to bring in capitalism, we're now starting to talk about corporate capitalism. And as we've been saying, people have appetites, and that's rock bottom, but corporations don't have appetites. They have greed for money, to put it in language that von Mises used. They became the basis. They sort of grabbed the thinkers behind that sort of thing, that laissez-faire capitalism, and later free enterprise, and more lately neoliberalism. They stole that much of liberalism because, of course, America and France particularly were established in that original liberal tradition, and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, for example, to quote the American founding document, that became, we forgot about equality. We moved to the absolute need for freedom, and freedom so that a corporation could have it was different from freedom, liberty for a person. A person has liberty so that they can make the best choices about their everyday life. That's the basis of liberties, to be free to take control, responsibility for what you're doing, particularly, as I would argue, about meals. And but that was not much use when you ran a large corporation that wanted to have some sort of rights in the political system in particularly the States. So liberalism shifted and became what became called classical liberalism. And out of classical liberalism grew modern economics, which, by the way, one of the main things I should say is that when we talk about the economy, we're talking about a very narrow part of one economy. We are talking about essentially the market economy, and that is a sort of strange version of the market economy where it's dominated by money, not by people hungry at a market. It's prices. And so modern economics grew out of a combination of the classical liberalism and doing sums. Locke and so forth, they were often medical people. When they looked at economics or economies, they were different from when you're a business person. And the economists tended in the 19th century to be business people, and they saw economies in terms of money and profits and rents and so forth. So they developed a whole series. There's something called the marginal revolution later in that the century before last, where they introduced the calculus. Modern economists love differential equations, these graphs, illustrations of that. That came in the 1870s, around the 60s, around there, and that changed the view of economics to these sums, these prices going up and down and making other things go up and down. And we forgot all about domestic economies or the natural economy, or as I said, the human person was an animal economy. They kind of got shunted aside, and what became important was price and making a profit out of it, buying and selling, and the stock exchange, etc., etc. Well, Ludwig von Mises, and as I say in the book, you don't have to say, well, he had a strange view about meals. 13 years, I think he had taken up with his future wife, wouldn't marry her until after his mother died. For 13 years, he never introduced his mother and her. Then she complained. She was Margit. She was an actor from the stage, and she complained in her interesting memoir of him that, for example, he never sat down for any meal without a coat on. Never ever. Like, he was extremely formal seeming, uptight guy, but he also had this fascination with the rationality of this economic system, and he took it so seriously and had so much influence. For example, Reaganomics and Thatcherism, they really derive from Mises' work, his big book, Human Action, in 1949, and he had a huge influence, seemingly not recognized, but perhaps because it's so nonsensical. I try in my chapter to kind of present seriously his thoughts, but they're so contradictory. I mean, one page you'll be saying, who runs this whole capitalist system? We all know that it's the consumer. The consumer asks for products to be made, and then he says, no, a few pages later, the thing about capitalism is it's run fabulously well by capitalists. So it's just nonsense, but it's because he's taken seriously the sums, these equations. And so he thinks everything, he becomes scientific about it and thinks that you can understand the entire world, every human action. That's his book's named Human Action. He thinks that can be explained by these equations. I mean, so he thinks, for example, he has an idea of subjective value. Subjective value, well, you might like champagne, but I prefer a milkshake. Well, that's just subjective. Like, that's what you want. I want something different. So he says, we can get rid of that because that doesn't count. That's not terribly scientific. Instead, what we do is say, you're prepared to pay, well, I'm prepared to pay $20. But anyhow, you're prepared to pay $200 for your champagne and pay, 2 shillings for your milkshake. So obviously there's a value. This is where value becomes scientific. We can see what people value and how important it is. Well, he then said, okay, so if the market runs everything, then democracy is totally dangerous. So he actually argues against democracy. He argues against equality. What nonsense is this idea that people are equal? That's just made up. It's just, he says. So he's established a really kind of basic neoliberal thing where everything is the market, everything. He had no morality other than the market. That set everything up. Well, of course.
Well, Michael, he pursued avidly the idea that we were both individualistic as a prime driver and also rational. But I'm glad to be able to tell you that The Economist said of him, Professor von Mises had a splendid analytical mind and an admirable passion for liberty, but as a student of human nature, he is worse than null, and as a debater, he is of Hyde Park standard. But the consequences of him, and let's not, put all the blame for the modern world on him, but corporations who understood how, in effect, to game the system, the political and the economic system, are the ultimate beneficiaries of his line of thinking. And you have compared Trump to von Mises as possibly the sort of, as you put it, the larrikin apotheosis of what von Mises argued for. But look, just now to get back to away from him and back to the central theme here of your book, and back to the end of your book, where you do paint a hopeful trajectory, one that's sort of rooted in the recent past. You yourself are a former restaurateur of what sounded to me like a fantastic establishment in South Australia. I would have it sounded just like my kind of restaurant. But you also write about people who in the 20th century really understood the importance of food and the way that our relationship to food had somehow got broken or lost. Elizabeth David, MFK Fisher, Alice Waters, who in the early 70s founded what was essentially a very political restaurant, Chez Panisse in Berkeley, California, still going to this day, insisting on locally grown ingredients wherever possible, understanding the relationship between her restaurant and society, and others. So I mean, your kind of final, clarion call is sort of back to the banquet table, and you have some very interesting ideas. I mean, first of all, do you feel that this appreciation of food, its importance in the economy now is back and established? I mean, foodie, the word foodie, or describing somebody as a foodie, can be a slightly condescending term, but to give it its very, very best, meaning, is foodieism, in your view, back? And what's the future? Now, Toby, one of our audience, asks, so what about COVID? Has it exposed the fragility of our food supply chains? What are the lessons there? Particularly, as he says, with farmers having difficulty with securing a workforce to pick the produce and the exploitation of those transient workers we have relied on for many years. You, at the end, the final chapters of your book, give us a way forward. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I think that there's hope from the amount of foodism around. When I started out, academia thought that, agreed with everyone else just about, that the meals didn't matter terribly much. They were, women's work or fuel for the working class or whatever. But in the probably the 1990s, that started to change and academics have become interested. I'm not sure if you're aware of a movement called the Food Sovereignty Movement, but they have attracted peasant and smallholder groups around the world, and are pushing to bring food back in. Many food activists in the cities seem to be doing that. And I don't think that it's totally coincidental that that the enemy of the right these days is the so-called liberal elites and the educated. I don't think it's totally coincidental that these people are often the foodies, and vice versa. So that there's a strong sense that food and meals, as I would like to see pushed rather than just food, I have a sense that meals are coming back in as a central interest, for an important interest for anyone who's interested in culture, society, economics, politics, whatever. Interestingly, the virus, it dampened down the distribution of my book, particularly in Australia, because suddenly air freight was way prohibitively expensive for books to be brought over from Columbia University Press. But at the same time, I took heart that two or three things, well, as I say, there is no one the economy. That is just to try and take over. That is to try and say everything relies on our economy, this capitalist economy, markets, blah blah. But one of the things that seemed to show up with under the threat of under the pandemic was the importance of the domestic economy. Suddenly, that it became. It wasn't just sourdough baking, which we've been doing, my wife's been doing for some years now, but it became quite fashionable to take up sourdough baking. It wasn't just that, it was just that people realized the importance of family. There were dire predictions about mental health deteriorating. Well, it hasn't seemingly done so quite as badly as people thought with people stuck at home. Hopefully that's because they realize that this is an important place to be, that this is in very many ways centers of our lives. The home table, the kitchen table, or the dining room is the center of the house. So that showed up under the coronavirus, but also another economy, the political economy, as I call it, the redistributive one run by governments, representing us, hopefully. They suddenly became much more important and powerful. Suddenly, not everything could be solved by the market. Suddenly, people had to confront again the fact that really the market is a handy thing, but we really do need some sort of centralized system as well. And even the market itself is split in an interesting way to me. I make a big thing about, for example, small businesses such as little restaurants are open domestic households. They tend to be run out of the home, almost literally, in many cases. And that's, they are not the same thing as big corporations, you know, the McDonald's and so on of the world. They have a whole different approach to restaurants. And what's happened to some degree under the present pandemic is that the conviviality of the actual market, like the face-to-face, the genuine market of actually exchanging actual goods, particularly foods, but that has, the conviviality of that has been actually dampened a bit, unfortunately, and the big corporations have moved in more. So again, I can see a lesson, not necessarily a happy one in that case, of how we are hopefully going to get some sense into us and start to realize, you know, where our real interests lie.
It's something you I think brought home for me in the book is that how our most memorable meals have to do with hospitality, with the hearth, and with home. Of course, they don't have to be at home. They can be in restaurants. And you know, in my case, 3 or 4 absolutely memorable meals in restaurants, as well as equally memorable ones at home. But there's a commonality. I mean, the best restaurants are those, as you describe it, that take the hospitality of the home and extend it. And in effect, you know, that's what you feel when you feel you've had a great experience in a restaurant. You felt that warmth, that care, that hearth, that sense of household. Now you're more radical than just calling for more restaurants to do that. You talk about public banqueting. Now that, I mean, a bit like our pandemic. It's not the shock of the new; it's the shock of the old. I mean, religious orders have been inviting the poor in to feed for millennia. But it's been a while. I once had a public banquet in India at a temple festival, but that's the only one that I can remember. It's been a while since most of us have been at a public banquet. But you make the case for one. Could you reiterate that?
Yeah, well, through the history of the state, through the history of the polis, through political history, in other words, the centerpiece has been a banquet. Back in the very earliest temple states run by priests, they would sacrifice things on the top of a ziggurat, a big pyramid, say, but they were the basis of a huge feast. I mean, the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures has descriptions of Solomon's goings on. Now, these were seriously big redistributive events where the government, King Solomon or whoever it was, drew in from the population, extracted from the population food, which was then redistributed, often to the poor, but often to running the court or the temple itself. And this kept going really until, well, it still does to some degree, but most notably collapsed in Paris in France with the collapse of Versailles, where the country was being run from a banquet. The centerpiece was the court based, all gathered together, and the king was called the Baker King and was responsible for the looking after the nation. Well, I don't think necessarily, and after the revolution, attempts were made to recreate the banquets. Instead of being grandiose things at a palace for selected participants, aristocrats, the idea was that they would have banquets up and down the streets, and this was tried, but it's not terribly practical. But I think if we were to think more metaphorically about a banquet, we would start to understand the point of a central government, the real point of a president is that they're bringing in the food that has been transformed into money for ease. So instead of bringing in tribute, they bring in taxes, and then they redistribute them. But we should try and see that more in meal terms. This is not some terrible chore. This is the pleasure of the pleasure of a banquet. As I say, not necessarily one where everyone sits down together, but in its shape, that's what I think governments could be thinking they're doing again.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, one of the things that you say about Brillat-Savarin, just to go back to that great person, you describe how a contemporary said he left the world like a satisfied diner leaving the banquet room. Now, before we leave our virtual banquet room in a few minutes' time, Michael, why don't we throw the conversation open as far as we're able to with the technology to the audience, because there are questions that various of you have posed. And one from Meg. Do you consider the issue of the price of food, the cost of food, in the book? For instance, I've told my children for years that food like beef is far too cheap when you take into consideration its impact on the earth. She also raises, the issues of pollution and farming on inappropriate land.
Yeah, I think the price of prices are important. I don't think that they're negligible. I think that what's wrong is to say that we are run by prices. We're meant to work to get money to pay certain things. The world is commodified. Everything is meant to have its price, and sometimes that price is indicative. It tells us something, and where I think it's very also right to think, well, the labour to get those vegetables is poorly reimbursed. We've got to change that system. The price might have to go up. Now, all those things, I think, follow or fit in with what I argue. I think the trouble is, if you get too doctrinaire about it, you go away from the Brillat-Savarin mode, and you're trying to set out laws that people have to follow in life, and that you're thinking that rather than having a sort of open, liberal, tolerant view of other people trying to work out the best way to do things, you're starting to say, no, that's the worst thing in the world, the poor payment of the people picking the raspberries or whatever. I absolutely, we should be talking about incomes and all the rest of it, and inequality, absolutely. But the way to, I suppose I'm arguing the way to think about it isn't to necessarily think, oh, well, we have to think about equality in this way, that it's, you know, a matter of justice or something. It's more than that. It's how we're sharing the planet badly or for better, and how we could be doing it. And it's a matter of working these things out from the basic issues around meals. That's what I'm trying to argue, without necessarily getting into too many specifics about injustices and so on.
Thanks, Michael. And yeah, a non-ideological economist would say, well, you know, the first thing you can do is to make sure that large farming or corporate food interests aren't getting something for free, either, you know, subsidized water or
Absolutely, no.
For the,
Yeah,
you know,
right.
for the environmental damage, or whatever. That might go some way. So now from John, I mean, it's related, but it's philosophically it goes deeper. From John, Michael, could you say a bit in detail about the distinction between appetite and greed as drivers of human activity, especially in regard to the idea of limits?
Okay, appetite is a physiological thing that we have. Whether we like it or not, we are driven by the laws of nature to make sure that we kind of look after ourselves to some degree. Now, that driver is quite different from greed in the sense of Milton Friedman and so on said greed is good. I mean, many economists have said greed is a wonderful thing. That's what we are like, bad, for good or ill, and we need more of it. We need to encourage greed because it brings a great industry from people, and we sort the world out best by people just pursuing their greed. But the trouble with that is that it becomes totally to do with money and endless. Like, one of the advantages of the appetite ecologically is that the appetite is satiable. We can eat enough. Like, we can think, I'm hungry, but now I've had a good feed. I'm happy. On the other hand, greed is insatiable. It's a kind of money, endless, boundless. In theory, you could just keep making money. So it's dangerous. It's the idea that we all need forever need more, rather than, yes, we can organize ourselves around our relatively limited needs, each of us.
Thank you. I'm just looking at more questions from here, and there's a message from Therese, who wants to give you a shout out for your part in organising the 23rd Symposium of Australian Gastronomy, and the banquets of that symposium are legendary. Another from Toby, and this maybe goes back to a part of the book we haven't spoken about. You speak quite approvingly of some television shows in the 50s that show families together at meals. The Donna Reed show. Now, I mean, they didn't survive the feminism of the 60s, because there was, the mother with her apron on, feeding the family, and she was doing that. She existed by the stove rather than at the table. But there was a conversation, and that was the striking thing. I mean, the irony is that, of course, the popularity of television shows like that really marked the start of the atomization of eating, at least in the American household. But a second question from Toby sort of speaks slightly to some of these issues, when he says that Adam Smith would have been lost without his mother preparing his food. How does the cook enjoy the spoils when there is no recognition of unpaid labor?
Well, yeah, again, Donna Reed, of course, herself, just to step back to that, was a fantastic professional person. She was not only the star of her show, but she was a producer of it. And it was very, very subtly, well, not even always that subtly, was often quite subversive. And in private life, she ended up fighting American conscription against the Vietnam War because she had sons involved and so on. So, but she, I mean, yeah, I hope I've explained in the book that she's much more, that those things were, those sitcoms were much more revolutionary than we might think, even though they were sponsored by Campbell's or, you know, fast food or factory foods. They showed the families actually having a meal. And the other thing that I think tended to be forgotten is that they were really the beginnings of the youth cult. They helped set off the famous 60s by saying how important the children were. The children had voices suddenly around the table. So anyhow, what was the other part about?
Well, about how to deal with people with no
Adam Smith
to provide food. Adam Smith having his meal prepared by his mum.
Yeah, there's a book with that in the title. Yeah, I mean, well, let's put it this way. I'm the cook around this household. Marion is the baker and the gardener. I'm not saying that there's not, shouldn't be any division of labor, and it's quite handy in the house. On the other hand, I don't think it necessarily has to be that the woman is the the donna of the shows. However, she might have used her freedom that she got relatively and allowed to get out and about. But yeah, I don't think. Well, let's hope that I've made the books, like it says, it's radical economics, and I think one of its problems is that it really is seriously radical. It is actually really taking us where we haven't been going enough, and I think that and so therefore questions, very much the liberal view is equality. And why? Because we all need to eat. It's pretty simple. Shylock said it, other people have said it, but it's one of the fundamental things. If you sit around the table, you share around the table, and that should be taken further out into society, and it is to some degree. But I hope that one thing I've been able to show in the book is that it is actually a much bigger question than we have often been thinking it is.
Well, thank you, Michael. We've run out of time, but you did make that call at the end, in effect, for us all to garden, shop, cook, and dine together. In the book, you in effect have a kind of Marxian call: banqueters of the world, unite to the table. And just to, in echoing Brillat-Savarin, I mean, I feel that I'm leaving this session as if I'm leaving a sort of intellectual banqueting room. The one time I met you, Michael, I was fortunate enough to come to your house in Sydney as you were moving in, and the thing that absolutely struck me was that first out of the packing boxes were the pots and pans, and they were hung up there over the stove or over the bench, and then next were the books. And I hope that all of you feel that we've brought food, conviviality, meals, and books, and especially Michael's wonderful book, together this evening. So thank you all very much, and thank you, Michael, and thank you back to Emma Kate.
And thank you, Dominic, and thank you, avid reader, very much for this. Yeah, I hope I've been able to explain myself to some degree.
Yes, it's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael and Dominic, for your great questions. And thank you all for attending tonight and for sending through your fantastic questions. We've had such great engagement this evening. I'm getting messages now from people saying, really excellent, loved it. Thank you so much, from Kate and Anthony. Yeah, so thank you all very, very much. I've shared the link a couple of times that you can use to purchase Michael's book from us in the chat box. Please do follow that link if you've enjoyed the event, and thank you all again for attending, and we'll look forward to seeing you at more of our events in the future. Have a lovely evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.